The dust stung Ethan's eyes as he stood on the cracked asphalt, the taillights of his family's old pickup fading into the Iowa sunset. At 17, he'd been cast out, his truth too heavy for the people who'd raised him. "You're no son of ours," his father's voice echoed, cold as the wind now whipping his thin jacket. Ethan clutched his backpack, the only thing he'd been allowed to take. Inside were a change of clothes, a dog-eared copy of Giovanni's room, and a photo of his late grandmother, the only one who'd ever seen him for who he was. The road stretched endlessly before him, a ribbon of uncertainty cutting through cornfields. He was alone, but the ache in his chest wasn't just pain, it was defiance. He'd survive this. He had to. The small town of Haverhill hadn't changed in a decade, its main streets still lined with faded storefronts and a single diner where truckers swapped stories over greasy coffee. Ethan had walked nearly 10 miles that first night, his sneakers rubbing blisters into his heels, before a kind-eyed trucker named Marla offered him a ride to Des Moines. "You look like you're running from something, kid," she'd said, her voice gruff but warm. Ethan didn't answer, but the way his shoulders slumped told her enough. In Des Moines, he found a shelter for runaway teens, a cramped building with peeling paint and a staff stretched thin. There, he met Javier, a wiry 19-year-old with a quick laugh and a scar above his left eyebrow. Javier had been kicked out of his own home in Texas for the same reason Ethan had. Loving someone's society said they shouldn't. "Family's just who you choose, man," Javier told him one night as they shared a bunk room, the hum of the city outside their window. Ethan clung to those words, letting them stitch together the pieces of his broken heart. Days turned into weeks, and Ethan learned to navigate the city. He got a job bussing tables at a diner, the kind where the neon sign flickered and the jukebox played Springsteen. Javier taught him how to dodge trouble, how to spot the good ones in a crowd, and how to laugh even when the world felt heavy. They became each other's anchor, two boys carving out a space where they could be themselves. Ethan's first real smile in months came when Javier dragged him to a drag show in a basement bar, the performers' glitter and courage lighting something new inside him. But survival wasn't easy. The shelter had rules, and Ethan's 18th birthday meant he'd have to leave. Javier had a plan, though, a friend in Chicago who ran a community center for queer youth. "We'll go together," Javier said, his dark eyes bright with possibility. Ethan hesitated. Chicago was a world away, and the road had already betrayed him once. But Javier's hand on his shoulder, steady and sure, made the fear feel smaller. The night before they left, Ethan sat on the shelter's roof, staring at the stars. He thought of his parents, their faces twisted with disgust as they'd driven away. He wondered if they ever thought of him, if they regretted it. The anger was still there, sharp and jagged, but so was something else, a quiet hope that he could build a life bigger than their rejection. The bus to Chicago smelled of stale coffee and diesel, but to Ethan, it was freedom. Javier slept beside him, his head lolling against Ethan's shoulder. As the city skyline came into view, Ethan felt his heart race. This was a chance to start over, to be more than the boy left on the road. In Chicago, the community center became their home. Run by a fierce woman named Lena, it was a haven for kids like them, cast out, misunderstood, but unbroken. Ethan enrolled in community college, studying literature, pouring his pain into essays about identity and belonging. Javier worked as a barista, his charm earning him tips and friends. They shared a tiny apartment above a laundromat, the hum of dryers lulling them to sleep. One night, as snow blanketed the city, Javier took Ethan's hand. "You ever think about what comes next?" he asked, his voice soft. Ethan looked at him, really looked, and saw not just a friend, but someone who'd seen him at his lowest and stayed. "Yeah," Ethan whispered, his breath catching. "I think it's you." Their first kiss was clumsy, nervous, but perfect. It was a promise that they'd face whatever came next together. Ethan didn't know it then, but that moment would be the foundation of everything he'd become. Chicago's winters were brutal, but Ethan and Javier found warmth in their cramped apartment, where they'd argue over whose turn it was to cook and laugh until their sides ached. Ethan was 20 now, his frame still lanky but his eyes brighter, carrying the weight of survival and the spark of hope. Javier, a year older, had a way of making every day feel like an adventure, whether they were exploring thrift stores or dancing to old vinyl records in their living room. Ethan's literature classes opened his world. He devoured books by Baldwin, Whitman, and Lord, their words giving voice to the feelings he'd buried back in Iowa. His professor, Dr. Ellis, a sharp-witted woman with gray streaks in her hair, saw his potential. "You've got a story to tell, Ethan," she said after reading one of his essays about growing up queer in a small town. "Don't be afraid to write it." Her encouragement lit a fire in him, and he started journaling, pouring out memories of the road, his parents' rejection, and the family he'd found in Javier and Lena. But the past wasn't done with him. One evening, as Ethan sorted through mail, he found a letter from Haverhill. His hands shook as he recognized his mother's handwriting. "We need to talk," it read, brief and cryptic, with no apology or warmth. He showed it to Javier, who frowned. "You don't owe them anything," Javier said, his voice firm. Ethan nodded, but the letter burned a hole in his thoughts. Why now? After 3 years of silence? He didn't respond, but the letter stirred memories he'd tried to bury. He remembered his father's sermons at the local church, preaching fire and brimstone while Ethan sat in the pews, feeling like a sinner just for existing. He remembered his mother's silence, her refusal to meet his eyes when he'd come out. The pain was still raw, a wound that hadn't fully healed. At the community center, Ethan threw himself into volunteering, helping younger kids navigate their own struggles. One teen, a shy girl named Mia, reminded him of himself, scared but fierce, hiding her truth from a family that wouldn't understand. He listened to her, shared bits of his story, and watched her eyes light up when he told her she was enough. Helping her felt like healing himself, piece by piece. Javier, meanwhile, was chasing his own dreams. He'd started taking art classes, his sketches of Chicago's streets and faces filling their apartment. One night, he showed Ethan a drawing of him standing on that Iowa road, the sky above him a swirl of color. "This is how I see you," Javier said. "Not broken. Unstoppable." Ethan's throat tightened, and he pulled Javier close, their foreheads touching. In that moment, he felt whole. But the letter from Haverhill lingered. Ethan started having nightmares, his father's voice, the screech of tires, the endless road. He'd wake up sweating, Javier's arms around him, whispering, "You're here. You're safe." Ethan wanted to believe it, but part of him wondered if he'd ever truly escape. One day, Lena called him into her office. "There's a writing contest," she said, sliding a flyer across her desk. "For queer voices. You should enter." Ethan hesitated. His journal was private, a raw map of his pain and hope. But Lena's steady gaze gave him courage. He spent weeks crafting a story about a boy left on a road, finding love and purpose in a city that embraced him. When he submitted it, he felt like he'd set a piece of his soul free. Months later, a call came from an unknown number. Ethan almost ignored it, but something made him answer. It was his sister, Claire, her voice trembling. "Dad's sick," she said. "Cancer. He's asking for you." Ethan's heart stopped. The man who'd abandoned him now wanted him back. He hung up without a word, his hands shaking. That night, he told Javier everything. "What if I go and it's just more pain?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Javier took his hand. "Then we'll face it together. But you don't have to decide now." Ethan nodded, but the weight of the call pressed down on him. He wasn't sure if he was ready to face the people who'd broken him, or if he ever would be. Ethan's story won the writing contest, earning him a small cash prize and an invitation to read at a literary event in Chicago. The night of the reading, he stood on a small stage in a crowded bookstore, his heart pounding as he shared his words. The audience, strangers, friends, Javier beaming in the front row, hung on every sentence. When he finished, the applause felt like a wave, washing away years of doubt. Dr. Ellis approached him afterward, her eyes shining. "You're going to do big things, Ethan," she said. For the first time, he believed her. But the call from Claire haunted him. He hadn't told Javier, but she'd called again, leaving a voicemail. "Mom's not doing well either," she'd said. "They both want to see you. Please, Ethan." He deleted the message, but it lingered like a bruise. Why should he care? They'd left him on that road, alone and terrified. Yet a small part of him, the part that still remembered his mother's lullabies, his father's rare smiles, wondered if there was something left to salvage. Javier noticed the change in him. "You're quiet lately," he said one morning as they shared coffee in their kitchen. Ethan sighed, confessing about the second call. Javier listened, his jaw tight. "They don't get to hurt you again," he said. "But if you need to go, I'll be with you. Every step." Ethan leaned into him, grateful for the anchor of his love. He decided to write back to Claire, a short letter saying he wasn't ready but would think about it. Mailing it felt like letting go of a small weight, but the question remained. Could he face them? The community center kept him grounded. He mentored more kids, including Mia, who was slowly coming out to her friends. Watching her grow gave Ethan purpose, a reminder that his pain could help others heal. One evening, Javier surprised him with a date to Lake Michigan. They walked along the shore, the city's lights reflecting on the water. Javier stopped, pulling a small ring from his pocket, a simple band he'd made in an art class. "I don't care about fancy," he said, his voice shaking. "I just want forever with you." Ethan's eyes filled with tears as he said yes, the ring a promise of a future they'd build together. The joy of that moment carried Ethan through weeks of uncertainty. His writing gained attention, and a local publisher offered to help him turn his journal into a memoir. The idea terrified him, exposing his life to the world, but Javier and Lena pushed him to take the leap. "Your story matters," Lena said. "It could save someone." Ethan started working on it, each chapter a step toward understanding his own resilience. But the past kept pulling. Claire's third call came on a rainy afternoon. "Dad's got weeks left," she said, her voice breaking. "Mom's not far behind. They're begging to see you, Ethan. They know they were wrong." Ethan's chest tightened. He wanted to scream, to tell her it was too late. But something in her voice, desperation, guilt, made him pause. He talked it over with Javier, who held him as he cried. "What if I regret not going?" Ethan asked. Javier kissed his forehead. "Then we go? But we do it on your terms." They decided to make the trip to Haverhill, not for his parents, but for Ethan, to close a chapter he'd left open too long. The drive to Iowa was quiet, the fields blurring past. Ethan's hands gripped the wheel, Javier's steady presence beside him. As they neared Haverhill, Ethan's heart raced. He didn't know what he'd find, forgiveness, anger, or something in between, but he knew he wasn't that scared boy on the road anymore. He was stronger, loved, and ready to face whatever came next. Haverhill hadn't changed. The same tired gas station, the same church steeple piercing the sky. Ethan parked outside his childhood home, a modest house with peeling paint and a sagging porch. His stomach churned as he and Javier stepped out of the car. "You got this," Javier whispered, squeezing his hand. Ethan nodded, but his legs felt heavy as he approached the door. Claire answered, her face older than he remembered, lines etched by worry. "Ethan," she said, her voice cracking. She hugged him, and he stiffened, unsure how to feel. "They're inside," she said, glancing at Javier with cautious curiosity. Ethan introduced him, proud but guarded. Claire led them to the living room, where his parents waited. His father, Robert, was a shadow of the man who'd cast him out. Cancer had hollowed his cheeks, his eyes sunken but sharp. His mother, Ellen, sat beside him, frail and pale, her hands trembling. The air was thick with unspoken words. "Ethan," Robert rasped, we were wrong." Ellen's eyes filled with tears, but she said nothing. Ethan's throat tightened. He'd imagined this moment 1,000 times, screaming at them, walking away, but now, seeing their fragility, he felt only a hollow ache. "Why now?" he asked, his voice steady despite the storm inside. Robert coughed, struggling to speak. "We thought we were saving you. We were wrong. We're so sorry." The apology landed like a stone. Ethan wanted to believe it, but years of pain screamed louder. "You left me on a road," he said, his voice breaking. "I was your son." Ellen sobbed, reaching for him, but he stepped back. Javier's hand on his shoulder kept him grounded. They talked for hours, the conversation raw and jagged. Robert admitted his fear, rooted in a rigid faith he'd since questioned. Ellen confessed her silence was cowardice, not rejection. Ethan listened, torn between anger and pity. He told them about his life, Chicago, Javier, his writing. Their eyes widened at the mention of his engagement, but they didn't flinch. Claire watched, her own guilt evident. She'd been at college when Ethan was kicked out, unaware until it was too late. "I should have fought for you," she said later, as they stood on the porch. Ethan nodded, forgiving her in a way he couldn't yet forgive his parents. That night, in a motel, Ethan broke down in Javier's arms. "I don't know if I can forgive them," he said. Javier held him. "You don't have to, but you faced them. That's enough for now." Ethan clung to him, grateful for a love that didn't falter. Back in Chicago, Ethan threw himself into his memoir. Writing about Haverhill was like lancing a wound, painful but cleansing. He described the road, the shelter, Javier's laugh, and the community that saved him. The words flowed, raw and honest, and he felt lighter with every page. A month later, Claire called again. Robert was gone. Ellen was fading fast. "She's asking for you," Claire said. Ethan hesitated, but something, maybe closure, maybe compassion, made him agree to return. Javier came with him as always. Ellen was in hospice, her breathing shallow. She took Ethan's hand, her grip weak but desperate. "I love you," she whispered. "I always did." Ethan's eyes burned, but he squeezed her hand. "I know," he said, not sure if he meant it. When she passed days later, he didn't cry. He felt empty, but free. Ethan stood at his mother's graveside, the Iowa wind biting his face. Claire was beside him, silent, her eyes red. Javier held his hand, a quiet pillar of strength. The funeral was small, just a few relatives who avoided Ethan's gaze. He didn't care. He'd come for himself, to say goodbye to the mother who'd failed him but tried, too late, to make amends. Back in Chicago, life moved forward. Ethan's memoir was nearing completion, and the publisher was thrilled, predicting it could resonate with countless readers. Ethan wasn't sure he was ready for that kind of exposure, but Javier's belief in him was unwavering. "You're telling the truth," Javier said. "That's what matters." The community center became busier, with more kids seeking refuge. Ethan and Javier started a writing workshop, helping teens like Mia put their stories on paper. Watching them find their voices was like watching himself heal, step by step. Mia's first poem, about her fear of coming out, brought Ethan to tears. "You're braver than I was," he told her. Javier's art was gaining traction too. A local gallery offered him a small show, and Ethan helped him frame his sketches. The night of the opening, Javier's drawing of Ethan on the road sold for more than they'd expected. "Told you you're unstoppable," Javier teased, kissing him in the crowded gallery. But closure with his family wasn't complete. Claire visited Chicago, wanting to rebuild their relationship. Over coffee, she shared stories of their childhood, memories Ethan had buried. "I want to be your sister again," she said. Ethan nodded, cautious but open. They started texting, small steps toward something new. One day, a letter arrived from a lawyer. His parents had left him a small inheritance, money from the sale of their house. Ethan stared at the check, torn. "It feels like blood money," he told Javier. They decided to donate it to the community center, funding scholarships for kids like them. Lena cried when they told her, pulling them both into a hug. Ethan's memoir was published the following spring. Titled The Road I Walked, it hit shelves with a quiet but powerful impact. Reviews called it raw and essential, and Ethan started getting letters from readers, teens, parents, strangers, who'd found hope in his words. One letter, from a boy in Kansas, said, "Your story made me feel less alone." Ethan framed it, hanging it above his desk. He and Javier planned their wedding, a small ceremony in the community center's backyard. Lena officiated, Mia read a poem, and their friends filled the space with love. As Ethan said his vows, his voice steady, he realized he'd built a family stronger than the one he'd lost. But the past wasn't done teaching him. A year after the wedding, Ethan got an email from a distant cousin, saying his father's old church was holding a memorial. They'd found Ethan's book and wanted him to speak. The idea felt absurd, returning to the place that had condemned him. Yet something in him stirred. Maybe his words could change someone there, the way they'd changed him. Ethan stood outside the Haverhill Church, its white steeple stark against the gray sky. Javier was beside him, his presence a reminder that Ethan wasn't alone. The memorial was small, just a few congregants and his cousin, Sarah, who'd reached out. Ethan's palms were sweaty as he clutched his speech, a single page of words he'd rewritten a dozen times. Inside, the pews smelled of polish and old hymnals. Faces turned, some curious, some wary. Ethan stepped to the podium, his heart racing. "I was left on a road because of who I am," he began, his voice steady. He spoke of his journey, pain, love, resilience, and the room was silent, hanging on his words. When he finished, a few people clapped, others looked away, but a teenage boy in the back met his eyes, tears streaming down his face. Afterward, the boy, Tim, approached him. "I'm like you," he whispered. "My parents don't know." Ethan hugged him, promising to stay in touch. That moment felt like the reason he'd come, not for his parents, but for kids like Tim, who needed to see a future beyond rejection. Back in Chicago, Ethan's book gained momentum. Invitations for readings and talks poured in, from bookstores to colleges. He and Javier traveled when they could, sharing their story. Javier's art complemented Ethan's words, and they started collaborating on a project, a graphic novel about their lives, blending Ethan's prose with Javier's illustrations. The community center grew too, thanks to the donation. Lena expanded the scholarship program, naming it after Ethan and Javier. They mentored more kids, including Tim, who'd moved to Chicago after coming out to his family. Some accepted him, others didn't. Ethan and Javier helped him navigate the pain, just as they'd done for each other. Claire became a regular part of their lives, visiting for holidays and calling weekly. She read Ethan's book, crying as she apologized again for not being there when he needed her. "You're here now," Ethan said, and they hugged, rebuilding what had been broken. One night, as Ethan and Javier worked on their graphic novel, Ethan paused, staring at a sketch of himself on that Iowa road. "I used to think that moment defined me," he said. Javier shook his head. "It started you, but you defined yourself." Ethan smiled, pulling him close. The road was still part of him, but it no longer held him back. Their wedding anniversary approached, and they planned a quiet celebration, just them, a picnic by Lake Michigan. As they sat on a blanket, watching the sunset, Ethan felt a peace he'd never known. He'd turned his pain into purpose, his rejection into love. The world wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. Years passed, and Ethan's life bloomed in ways he'd never imagined. The graphic novel, Road to Us, was published to critical acclaim, its pages a vibrant tapestry of his and Javier's journey. Schools and libraries stocked it, and Ethan received letters from readers worldwide, each one a reminder that his story mattered. He and Javier bought a small house in Chicago, a cozy space filled with books, art, and the laughter of friends. The community center became a beacon for queer youth, with Ethan and Javier as its heart. They expanded the writing workshop, helping dozens of kids find their voices. Mia, now in college, became a poet, dedicating her first chapbook to Ethan. Tim, too, thrived, pursuing a degree in social work to help others like him. Ethan watched them grow, his heart full, knowing he'd helped light their paths. Claire moved to Chicago, taking a job at a local nonprofit. Their bond deepened, rooted in shared healing. She became an aunt to the kids at the center, her warmth a quiet apology for the years they'd lost. Ethan forgave her fully, their laughter over old family stories a bridge to a new future. One spring, Ethan was invited to speak at a national conference for LGBTQ+ youth. Standing before hundreds, he shared his story, not just the pain, but the love, the family he'd built, the life he'd claimed. Javier sat in the audience, his eyes shining with pride. The standing ovation felt like a celebration of every step Ethan had taken since that lonely road. As they aged, Ethan and Javier never stopped dreaming. They traveled, spoke, and created, their love a constant through every challenge. When Javier's health began to falter in their 50s, Ethan cared for him with the same fierce devotion Javier had always shown. "You're still my adventure," Javier whispered one night, his hand in Ethan's. They faced it together, as always. In their final years, they sat on their porch, watching the city they'd made their home. Ethan's memoir, now a classic, was taught in schools. Their graphic novel inspired a film. But to Ethan, the greatest legacy was the love they'd shared, the kind that turned a boy left on a road into a man who changed lives. When Javier passed, Ethan grieved deeply but held on to their memories. He kept mentoring, writing, and loving, knowing Javier was with him in every word, every act of kindness. And when Ethan's time came, he faced it with peace, surrounded by the family he'd chosen: Claire, Mia, Tim, and countless others whose lives he'd touched. The road that had once broken him became the story that saved others. Ethan's life was proof that love, resilience, and truth could triumph over rejection. And somewhere, in the quiet of his heart, he knew his parents, flawed and human, had seen it too, in the end.